All right, let's dive into this one nation, one election thing. It's everywhere right now, and you've given us a mountain of stuff to go through.
Yeah, there's a lot here.
Including this report from a high-level committee.
Mhm.
Looks like they talked to everybody.
It seems like it.
Yep.
Political parties, legal experts, former judges, even election commissioners. I mean, they really did their homework.
And, you sent this over, and the thing that really jumped out at me, the thing that I was like, we have to do a deep dive on this, was this idea that holding all of our elections at once,
Oh, yeah.
Sabha, state assemblies, even local bodies, that it might actually be good for the Indian economy.
Right. That's a bold claim.
It is. And I have to admit, I was skeptical at first. I was like, really? How could that possibly work?
Yeah, it's not immediately intuitive, is it?
But then I started digging into the report, and they've got some pretty interesting data and arguments. They've actually connected this idea of synchronized elections to things like higher GDP growth, lower inflation.
Yeah.
It's not just about the logistics. It's about potentially, creating a more stable environment for the whole country.
It is. It's about long-term thinking, long-term planning.
Yeah.
And it's about, reducing the kind of disruptions and uncertainties that can come with these constant election cycles.
Okay, so before we get into the economic magic trick, maybe we should take a step back and just sort of level set on how elections actually work in India right now. Because it's a bit of it's a lot, isn't it?
It is. Think of it like a constantly moving carousel of elections.
Yeah.
So you've got the Lok Sabha, our national parliament, which has its own election cycle.
Right.
And then you've got each state, right, with its own assembly elections.
Right, happening at different times.
Exactly, at different times. So it's like this constant churn. Just in 2024 alone, we've got 6 states heading to the polls.
Yeah.
And that's not even counting all the local body elections that happen throughout the year.
It's a lot to keep track of. And just to be clear, we've got the Election Commission of India, the ECI, running the national show. And then each state has its own state election commission, the SEC,
Yes.
for local and assembly elections. It's a lot of moving parts.
It is. It is.
Which I guess is part of the argument for ONO-E, right? Like, let's simplify this whole thing.
Exactly. The proponents of ONO-E are saying, imagine if we could hit pause on this carousel, have everyone vote on the same day, and then get back to the business of actually running the country.
Makes sense. But wait a minute, haven't we done this before? Didn't India actually have simultaneous elections like way back when?
You're absolutely right. From 1951 to 1967, India did have synchronized elections. But things got a little complicated. We had some hung parliaments, and some states ended up needing to hold early elections, and so gradually we kind of shifted away from that model.
Okay, so it's like we're thinking about going back to our roots in a way.
Sort of, yeah.
But with a 21st century twist. Now, I know the high-level committee really dug into this, but for those of us who are just joining the conversation, what's the big why behind ONO-E? Like, what are the supposed benefits?
Well, apart from the potential economic boost, which we'll unpack a bit later, there's the cost factor. The Law Commission of India actually estimated that holding simultaneous elections could save the government a massive 4,500 crore rupees.
4,500 crore, that's not chump change.
No, it's not. That's a significant amount of money.
But how would we save that much? Like, what are the actual savings?
Well, think about it. All those separate elections, each one requires manpower. You need security personnel, transportation, EVMs, all of that.
Makes sense.
If we synchronize everything, we could streamline all of that, right? Cut down on a lot of redundant expenses. It's like bulk buying for democracy, I guess you could say.
Okay, fewer trips to the polls, less money spent. I get it. But what about this argument I keep hearing that all this electioneering, it kind of gets in the way of actual governing?
Right, right. And this is where the Model Code of Conduct comes in.
Oh, yeah.
So whenever elections are announced, the government has to follow this code. It puts restrictions on what they can announce, what they can do policy-wise.
Right, because you don't want them to be, influencing voters unfairly.
Exactly, exactly. So it's meant to be a level playing field.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's like a quiet period for the government in a way.
Quiet period.
But if you have elections happening all the time, then the government is constantly in this restricted mode.
Aha.
Which can lead to delays in decision-making, delays in project implementation, all sorts of things.
Makes sense.
So proponents of ONO-E are arguing that simultaneous elections would basically minimize these disruptions and let the government, focus on governing.
So less campaign mode and more get things done mode.
Exactly.
I like it. But I have to ask, wouldn't people get voter fatigue? If we had these massive multi-level elections all at once, wouldn't turnout really go down?
That's a common concern. But the HLC actually found some interesting evidence to the contrary. They looked at some states, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, where the assembly elections happened to coincide with the Lok Sabha polls back in 1999. And guess what? Voter turnout actually increased in those cases.
Interesting. So maybe having everything on the same day, it would be more convenient, right? People could just go and vote for everything at once.
Exactly. Less travel, less time commitment, and potentially, a stronger sense of civic engagement. It's a potential win-win.
All right, so we've got potential cost savings, less disruption to governance, and maybe even higher voter turnout. This is starting to sound pretty good, but I'm sure there are some downsides too, right? It can't all be sunshine and roses.
Of course.
Yeah.
As with any major policy change, there are complexities and concerns.
Right.
And some of them are pretty significant.
Yeah.
We should probably delve into those.
Definitely.
But after this.
Okay, so we've talked about all the potential upsides of this one nation, one election idea, right? The cost savings, the efficiency gains, maybe even this boost to our economy. But I have a feeling you didn't give us all this material just to hear us talk about the good stuff. What are the skeptics saying? What are the things that could go wrong with this?
Well, there are some pretty big concerns. Some critics worry that ONOE could actually be a step backward for our democracy, especially when it comes to the balance of power between the central government and the states.
You're talking about federalism.
Right. Exactly.
That whole idea of power sharing between the different levels of government.
That's it. And, India is this incredibly diverse country with, unique regional needs and priorities.
Right.
Critics are arguing that ONOE could actually tilt the scales too far in favor of national issues and potentially drown out those regional voices.
Right. So in a country as vast and diverse as India, it's important to make sure that those local concerns don't get lost in the national shuffle. But how would ONOE actually make that happen? Like, how would it actually lead to that?
Well, think about it. If you have these simultaneous elections, the big national issues and the big national parties, they're likely to dominate the campaign, right? It's like a spotlight shining on the national stage. And those regional issues and the smaller parties, they might struggle to be heard.
It's like trying to have a conversation in a really crowded room, right?
Exactly.
Sometimes the loudest voices, they drown out the more nuanced ones.
Exactly.
Did the report mention any specific concerns from regional parties?
Oh, absolutely. The Samajwadi Party, for instance, has been quite vocal about this.
Okay.
They're arguing that ONOE could create a situation where regional parties, which often represent, very specific local interests, get sidelined in this kind of in this national frenzy.
So it's not just about the mechanics of voting. It's about making sure that all voices, especially those representing these diverse regional interests, they have a fair chance to be heard. But even beyond this whole federalism debate, aren't there some pretty big practical hurdles too? Like, how do we actually make this happen? We can't just snap our fingers and have everyone vote on the same day.
Right, you're hitting at a crucial point. To actually implement ONOE, we would need some significant constitutional changes. Articles 83 and 172, which deal with the tenure of the Lok Sabha and state assemblies, would need to be amended.
Okay, so we're talking about potentially rewriting parts of our Constitution.
Yeah.
That's not something to be taken lightly. Were there any concerns in the report about how these changes, could impact the very foundation of our democracy?
Yes, definitely. Some legal experts have raised concerns about whether these amendments could potentially violate what's called the basic structure of the Constitution. It's a complex legal debate.
It sounds like a potential legal minefield.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you've got the logistical challenges. I mean, India is not a small country.
No.
Holding elections for, over 1 billion people is already this massive undertaking.
Yeah.
How do we manage to do all that on the same day?
Yeah, it's like trying to, organize the world's largest synchronized swimming routine, but with ballot boxes instead of swimsuits.
It's a pretty vivid image. But to be fair, the Election Commission of India does have a pretty impressive track record of conducting these large-scale elections efficiently.
Right.
So wouldn't be easy, but it's not impossible.
Okay, so maybe the ECI could handle the logistics, but what about all these constitutional hurdles and these concerns about federalism that we talked about? Did the high-level committee actually come up with any solutions?
They did. They recognized all these complexities, and they proposed a kind of phased approach to implementing ONOE. So the first step would be synchronizing the Lok Sabha and the state assembly elections.
Okay, so a gradual rollout rather than a big bang. That sounds a little more manageable. And then what? How do they bring the local body elections, which are handled by the states, into the mix?
Well, they suggested that local body elections should be aligned with the Lok Sabha and assembly polls, but with a bit of a buffer, like within 100 days of those elections.
Okay, so ultimately we'd have this three-tier synchronized system, national, state, and local, all happening within, a specific time frame. But what about those concerns we discussed earlier? The potential for ONOE to, disrupt the powers of the state election commissions, the risk of national issues overshadowing regional ones. Did the report address those at all?
Yes, they did. One of their key recommendations was to create a single electoral roll for all elections. Look, Sabha, assemblies, local bodies, everything.
Wait, so instead of having these separate voter lists for each type of election, we'd have one master list managed by the Election Commission of India.
Precisely. It would streamline the whole process, reduce confusion, make sure that voter information is consistent across all levels.
I can see how that would be really appealing from an administrative standpoint, but wouldn't that require the states to essentially hand over control of their voter data to the ECI?
That's a valid point. And the HLC acknowledged that any changes affecting the SECs and local body elections, they would need the buy-in from the states. In fact, they specifically mentioned that certain constitutional amendments would need to be ratified by at least half of the states in order to actually become law.
So building consensus among the states is going to be crucial for making this ONOE thing a reality. It's interesting how this whole debate, it goes way beyond just the logistics of voting. It touches upon some really fundamental questions about how we want to govern ourselves as a nation.
It really does. It's about finding that balance, right, between efficiency and representation, between national unity and regional autonomy. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating.
Speaking of fascinating, I can't forget about the elephant, or maybe I should say the lack of rupees in the room. We keep talking about this potential economic upside of ONOE, but how does holding elections on the same day, how does that magically translate into a better economy?
Right. That's the part that really caught my eye, too. The HLC didn't just focus on the political and logistical aspects. They actually commissioned an economic analysis to see if there was any historical evidence to support this claim that ONOE could boost growth.
Okay, so they actually crunched the numbers. What did they find?
And this is where things get really interesting. Their analysis showed that historically, India has actually experienced higher GDP growth, lower inflation, and increased investment in the periods following simultaneous elections, compared to, times when elections were staggered.
Hold on, so you're saying that having everyone vote on the same day, it could actually lead to a stronger economy?
That's what the data seems to suggest, yes.
That seems counterintuitive. How does that even work?
There are a few potential explanations, and they all tie back to this idea of stability and certainty.
Okay.
Remember we were talking about the model code of conduct?
Yeah.
Well, when you have elections happening constantly, the government is constantly under those restrictions, which can make businesses hesitant to invest and plan for the long term.
So it's like a stop and start pattern.
Exactly.
That creates uncertainty and makes it harder for the economy to really gain momentum.
Precisely. But with ONOE, those periods of restriction would be shorter and less frequent, potentially leading to a more predictable and business-friendly environment.
Less uncertainty, more confidence, more investment. Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here. But beyond the MCC, are there other ways that ONOE could impact the economy?
Yeah, there's also this argument that simultaneous elections could lead to more efficient government spending.
Okay.
So if politicians aren't constantly in campaign mode, they might be able to focus more on long-term planning and strategic investments that can really benefit the economy in the long run.
Yeah, if you're always worried about the next election, it's hard to think about the big picture, right?
Exactly. And those long-term investments, infrastructure, education, technology, those are the things that can really drive sustainable economic growth.
Okay, so we've gone from saving money on election logistics to potentially boosting the entire Indian economy. It's a pretty compelling argument. I have to admit, I'm still wrestling with those concerns about federalism and the potential for ONOE to really centralize power.
Those are valid concerns, absolutely. And it's important to, weigh them carefully. The HLC report, It acknowledges these complexities, and it really stresses the need for a cautious and phased approach.
It sounds like this isn't a simple yes or no issue.
It's not.
It's about understanding the trade-offs, considering those long-term implications, and ultimately, deciding what kind of democracy we want to build for India's future.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable, right? It's not about giving you a definitive answer. It's about equipping you, the listener, with the knowledge and insights you need to form your own informed opinion.
So as we sort of wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you.
Oh.
If this one nation, one election thing, if it actually happened, what would it mean for you, for the average person listening to this right now? Would you be excited about this, this potential for more efficiency and maybe a better economy? Or would you be more worried about, what could happen to regional representation and that balance of power in our democracy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, there's no easy answer. It really comes down to what you value most. I mean, do you prioritize having a more streamlined, efficient system, even if it potentially gives more power to the central government, or do you think it's more important to preserve that autonomy of the states, make sure that all those diverse voices are heard, even if it means, maybe things are a little less efficient?
Yeah, it's like choosing between two paths, right? Each one has its own promises and potential, pitfalls. And it's not just about these abstract principles. It's about how these choices could actually impact your everyday life.
Right. I mean, just imagine a scenario where the government is able to actually implement policies more quickly. They're not constantly distracted by election cycles.
Okay.
So that could mean faster infrastructure development, quicker responses to economic challenges, maybe even, lower taxes if those cost savings we talked about actually materialize.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
Right. But then on the flip side, imagine a scenario where your local concerns, the things that matter most to you in your community, things like, water scarcity or agricultural policies, they get overshadowed by these big national debates during one of these, mega elections.
Yeah.
Would you feel like your voice was being heard? Or would you be worried that your needs were being overlooked?
I see what you're saying.
It's a trade-off, right?
It is.
There's no perfect solution. And any decision is likely to have, both positive and negative consequences.
It's like that old saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. But in this case, the eggs, there's some pretty fundamental aspects of our democracy.
Right. That's a great analogy. And it highlights the need for, careful deliberation and a clear understanding of those potential, risks and rewards.
So as you're listening to this and thinking about it, and as you're, maybe reading more about it on your own, think about what matters most to you in a democracy. Is it that efficiency? Is it that sense of national unity, even if it comes at the cost of maybe a little less regional autonomy? Or is it about preserving that diversity of voices and making sure that those local concerns, they really have a seat at the table, even if it means, maybe a slightly less streamlined, less efficient system?
It's a complex equation, no doubt.
It is.
But by engaging in this conversation, understanding those nuances, thinking about the consequences, I think we can contribute to shaping a more informed and democratic future for India.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have.
From the historical context to the economic arguments, the logistical challenges, those constitutional hurdles. But ultimately, the decision of whether or not to embrace this one nation, one election, it rests with the people of India.
And that's the beauty of a democracy, isn't it?
It is. It's a system where we, the citizens, we have the power to shape our own destiny.
Absolutely.
So as you continue to explore this issue, don't just listen to, the talking heads or the political pundits. Read those reports, engage in those discussions, talk to your friends and family about it, and most importantly, form your own opinion.
Yeah, based on what you believe is best for India's future.
Because the future of our democracy is it's too important to be left to chance. It's a conversation that demands our attention. It demands our critical thinking and our active participation.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into one nation, one election. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even, a little bit inspiring.
And we encourage you to, keep exploring this issue. The more informed we are as citizens, the better equipped we'll be to make those choices that will shape the future of our democracy.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. We'll see you next time.